Welcome to the 2020 November Wikimedia Research Showcase. I'm Martin Gerlach, a research scientist here at Foundation. I'm the host for today's showcase. Today's theme will be around the topic of interpersonal communication on Wikipedia. Without doubt, these interactions, for example, via talk pages, play a crucial role for editors to coordinate their efforts. And there are and have been many ongoing initiatives at the Foundation to improve communication. To learn more about recent research on interpersonal communication, we have two speakers here today invited. Let me briefly introduce them. That is, the first presentation will be by Anna Rader. She will, I hope I pronounced that name correctly. She will give an overview on editors' communication networks and patterns and the different types of dynamics that are commonly found in the ways that users interact. And in the second presentation by Sneha Narayan, she will present results from a study investigating whether easier interpersonal communication actually leads to enhanced productivity and newcomer participation. Our plan is to have for each talk around 30 minutes and with 10 minutes of discussion after each talk. So we're happy to take your questions in the chat, in the YouTube chat, or on IRC. Isaac Johnson, my colleague from the research team, will monitor the channels and relay the questions during the Q&A. And without further ado, please, I will ask Anna for a presentation. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Martin. Hi, everybody. I'm just going to try and share my screen so that you can see my slides. Okay. Is that working, Martin?
Yes, this works. I can see your screen.
Okay, great. So my presentation is called Talk Before You Type. I am a research consultant, and I've been doing some work with the Wikimedia Foundation over the last year, conducting desk research and helping to get an overview of the kind of ecosystem of academic research on Wikipedia, in particularly looking at editor motivations and interpersonal communication. So this isn't a surprise to most of you. You're all very familiar with Wikipedia. We know that people work out of their homes, out of their offices, sometimes in organized edits in the library, in the museum, but most of the time people are working asynchronously, anonymously, and individually. And so when they do interact with other editors, these are coincidental and indirect. There's a kind of dance of edit and counter edit on each article, but they don't necessarily directly engage with each other. Nonetheless, there is a significant substructure of interpersonal communication that we find in IRC channels and talk pages. And it's in this talk that Wikipedia users collaborate on editing, identify tasks that need to be shared, coordinate work to be done, and negotiate the kind of normative architecture, the policy conventions that are continually in flux. Now, in that sense, as a community of very diverse people working independently, there's a very complex social system at work. Although the normative architecture, the policy conventions, offers a way to regulate and smooth interpersonal interaction by giving rules, there are also many implicit conventions of behavior. And studies show that users adopt particular social roles. They're vandal hunters, substantive editors, administrators, and they focus their talk in ways that fit these preferred roles and interests. And unsurprisingly, in many cases, there is a kind of loudest voices problem, and more experienced users often dominate the conversations. So based on a desk review that I did of English language open access academic literature on peer-to-peer interaction in the Wikipedia English Wikipedia community, I want to kind of talk about 3 key themes that we see in terms of the dynamics of Wikipedia Talk. And I'm talking mainly about article talk, but this also does include IRC and policy talk and other kind of congregational areas like the village pump. So firstly, are these discussions competitive or deliberative? Are they designed to be antagonistic, or are they driving at trying to find some kind of consensus about how to edit particular items? Secondly, do users communicate to further their collective goals about enhancing an encyclopedia, or is this very much still about independent activity? We know from studies that Wikipedia users are motivated sometimes by altruistic ideas about what the encyclopedia can do. But at the same time, for many people, this is a solo activity. The third theme is whether the tone of these comments is supportive, particularly towards newbies and unregistered users, or whether it tends to be authoritative and dominated by particular voices. So the first theme, this idea of kind of antagonism or consensus, researchers find that Wikipedia Talk can be pleasant and polite and helpful, but it also can be critical and hostile, particularly towards new or unregistered members. Now, of course, structurally, there are norms in place to encourage editors to be inclusive and to give reasons for their edits, which is kind of indicators of what we think of as deliberation. But other studies have suggested that, in fact, this consensus is only partial. Black and colleagues studied the discussion page of the no personal attacks policy to evaluate whether comments were considerate and respectful, but they found that the overwhelming majority of posts didn't balance the opinions of other users and were typically marked by sarcasm and kind of nitpicking. Kitter and Kraut also acknowledged that talk pages can be marked by conflict. They thought that users tried to diffuse disputes by trying to find consensus. But on the other hand, in their study, Butler, Joyce and Pike have argued that this rough consensus is actually really shaped by dominant voices, and true consensus is rare. So this seems to suggest that studies have found that the deliberative nature that kind of underwrites this collaborative ethos of Wikipedia is more likely to be outdone by a more competitive kind of antagonistic tone. Right, the second kind of bundle of ideas and research is about whether these talk interactions are motivated by pro-social concerns or whether they're used instrumentally, and equally whether collaborations are purely coincidental or evidence of network relationships. So for instance, Heather Ford, in her review of the editing work around the 2011 Egyptian Revolution, found that editors did use talk pages collaboratively to find sources and update references as the breaking news evolved. But in 2012, Keegan argued instead that these don't really create kind of networks or concerted behavior. Rather, editors, and particularly high volume editors, even in breaking news where one requires reaching out to a host of different editors and resources, users tended to work independently on their own and just to use talk pages to glean information that they needed for their own article. Thirdly, this dynamic around whether the loudest voices are supportive or authoritative. Now, what is the tone that is taken in talk pages? Now, of course, we know that there are a number of hierarchies of experience and engagement and editing privilege in Wikipedia, between CISOP and registered and unregistered users, between newbies and veterans, for instance. And these are evident in talk pages. Now, some research suggests that certain users will act as hubs that interact with many others, including people outside of their kind of editing web of relation, and that they might use their IRC channel or their talk page as a kind of resource for other editors. Other types of users tend to be more authoritative, and they interact preferentially with only other experienced users. In the talk on articles, these experienced users tend to use policy citations and their knowledge of convention in order to claim legitimacy for their work and their edits, engaging in power plays with other users. And this means that newbies and unregistered users or infrequent users end up kind of deferring to the credibility of the more senior editors and getting shut down in the talk. So this is a really quick overview, and I'm very open to questions, but I thought it would just be useful to review what some of this literature finds in terms of what could be the key recommendations to enhance interpersonal communication in light of these kind of sets of dynamics. So many of these are not new, but they nonetheless recur in the research, and therefore is worth repeating. So there are several themes, and I bundled them in 5 main areas. The first one is about connecting lines of communication. We know that users sometimes have difficulty understanding where and when communication takes place. Is it on the article talk page? Is it on their personal talk page? Is it in more communal areas of the encyclopedia? We know that there have been calls to improve notifications, threading, signatures, and other conventions, and these continue to be important. Secondly, encouraging sensitive feedback, minimizing sarcasm, and fostering kindness are all repeatedly recommended as conduits to enhanced interpersonal relations. Thirdly, DeCindio and Peraboni, in their article, they argue that people participate in open environments in order to, online environments in order to feel a win-win experience. They want to give their time freely, and in return, they want to have their voices heard. And Wikipedia users, particularly new and episodic editors, they want to be part of governance and part of the discussion. So how can their inclusion in these discussions be increased? Fourthly, as a virtual forum, Wikipedia obviously deals with the same challenges as other forms of computer-mediated communication. And there is some research that suggests that enabling people to see each other's contributions more and provide feedback, it leads to improved feelings of respect and satisfaction. So designing in opportunities for direct interaction between members can lead to positive feelings that it motivate continued participation. And relatedly, signaling Wikipedia's editors their place within interaction networks may help to enhance peer-to-peer support. For instance, by showing how people might be related, the themes that they're interested in, to encouraging mentoring and co-editing. Now, obviously, many of these things are in development or by Wikipedia, but I think these come up again and again, so it's interesting to review these. Here are some of the references, and I'm happy to share a longer bibliography if that's of use to the audience. Yeah, that was just to fly through some of those themes and to offer an introduction to the second paper and to kind of kick off discussion about how talk works and the importance of interpersonal communication in Wikipedia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, for the presentation. We have plenty of time for question and discussion around this. Is there anything from YouTube or IRC?
There's no questions yet from both. I'll pass on. There's been some compliments about the slides and a lot of excitement about the content in them. So, and I hope that the slides get released after the showcase. So, pass that on.
Then I would pass it to the room here if anyone would like to chime in with a question.
I guess out of curiosity, I would also love to hear more about how you went about conducting this literature review. Like, did you sort of start with a couple papers and do like other bibliography searches? I guess were there organizing principles for how you did this search? And I was curious if you could just tell us more about your process.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I didn't want to go on about methodology too much. But yeah, I've been basically trying to create an online repository of open access material about Wikipedia, primarily English Wikipedia, but also other projects that I'm hoping is somehow going to be hosted on in a commons way that will be openly available. And as part of that, I've been doing like a annotated literature review and trying to develop different themes, but these are also about questions that have been coming out of Wikimedia Foundation. In terms of the research question, this was really about how do users interact? What does that interaction look like? What is that talk activity like? And I think trying to not use paywalled articles means that you are, open to, different kinds of themes, and often these are conference papers or working papers or presentations, and that can be a really fruitful part of the research process. And I think why I wanted to offer in the slides is a way of kind of a thematic overview of the themes that kind of emerge out of this, because it's actually a really small community of people who write about Wikipedia. And so there's, we see the same literature again and again, and yet in some sense there's not that much talking to. So that we see, for instance, in the recommendations, we see these things again and again, or we see kind of a brief literature review and then a lot of quantitative data that maybe doesn't speak to kind of the acknowledging other work and the kind of landscape in which this is happening. And I think that partly that's because people write about Wikipedia from many different kinds of disciplines. And so there's some siloing that's taking place, and I'm hoping that this kind of work offers a way of bringing into conversation these different disciplines and approaches.
Thanks for that. I appreciated it.
There's now a bunch of questions floating in via YouTube and IRC, so this is good. So I'll jump into it, into a couple. So the first one coming from YouTube is how do you kind of define collaboration on Wiki? Like what constitutes, I guess, collaboration on these talk pages?
Are we going to do one by one, or are we going to do a bunch of questions?
We'll do one by one, because otherwise I get lost, I think.
Okay, yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I would say that I'm offering an overview of the research, and I actually think that this is a key issue. Is that what does collaboration mean? And it seems to mean different things to different disciplines and different types of studies. Sometimes it's enough for someone to simply have said, I'm looking for this source, and someone else jumps in and says, hey, I'm going to find that for you. And in other cases, we see that collaboration is demanded at a much higher standard. So it's about really about a network of editors who rely on each other, who understand each other's shorthand, who work together, for instance, in order to bring an article to kind of featured level. And so we see a range of that. And I think that pinpointing with more precision what we mean by collaboration is useful from a data point of view, so that we can really kind of be clear about when we talk about a kind of collaborative ethos, or where we talk about people working together, is it enough for it to be a temporary coincidental assemblage of users, or is it enough for it to be just a pair of users, or do we want to see when we talk about this a greater kind of establishment of nodes of people working together?
I think there's another question that was asked that kind of builds on this interestingly. The question was asked whether there was any comparison to offline consensus building. And, in light of this discussion on what collaboration means, I think that maybe is an interesting follow-up question then.
Yeah, so one of the reasons why I brought in the discussions of kind of deliberation is because in a fairly horizontal community, which technically Wikipedia is, we might see more efforts to include voices, to ensure that the pros and cons are evaluated, to make sure that everyone is given an opportunity to speak, and like an attempt to kind of find a way around problems, to work together, to use the talk activity to seek consensus. Now, the reality is that these kind of deliberative communities are quite rare offline as well. There are many impediments, including a kind of the domination by particular leaders, the difficulty of actually including many voices, and of actually leading towards decisions rather than just being bogged down in discussion. And I think that would be something that is a really rich area of comparison in the literature that I reviewed for this project. I didn't find any of the comparisons between the offline and the wiki world. And I'm not to say that there isn't some, but in the parameters of the research that I was doing, it wasn't available. And I'd be interested to hear what the audience thinks, what their observations or insights would be on that.
Yeah, no, and hopefully as if people respond in the comments, I'll pass them on as well. I can keep going, but if people in the room want to cut me off, feel free to. So another question that was brought up on YouTube was asking you what the most surprising thing you learned in this literature review was.
It's not directly related to this project, but it was part of the broader work, was understanding the patterns and the time that people give to the project, and the way that people structure into their daily life. And I think that it's really amazing the way that certain contributors find the time as part of the daily schedule to check in and to make edits, and the commitment that people show. And what's surprising is that this isn't really connected up with discussions about interpersonal communication. So they assume, and this is related to the previous question, we assume that there's a kind of closed communication network within Wikipedia, but we don't know whether people then talk about Wikipedia, you know, outside, like how do they connect the two worlds? And there's some research that suggests that the online persona kind of is really fulfilling, and like you don't want to, you know, connect that outside, and yet like there must be some kinds of connections. There must be the way that if people give so much of their time to Wikipedia, that you know, how does that connect to editathons? How does that connect to groups of people who meet in real life to talk about Wikipedia? What are those interactions? And I know that there's been some studies from a few years ago that suggested that when people try to talk about the outside world, they get shut down. There's a kind of convention against social networking in Wikipedia, but none of that has been really updated. You know, there's some of that's from kind of 2011, so that's part of a thread of research that I think that we would really benefit from seeing.
If I can keep going, there's another question that was just asked that I think is relevant to this, which is, what patterns did you notice among the editors who and how they perceive the purpose and value of talking with other editors, and whether those perceptions matched up with like what you were observing, I guess, in practice?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to be evasive. I'm just kind of presenting what the desk research offers, and this is a big gap. So, you know, I'm a qualitative researcher, and I find it really surprising that very few of these studies include deep analysis of actual talk activity, interview participants in order to understand the perspectives. We often see with Wikipedia, and perhaps the second speaker can speak more to this, like we see evaluations of the whole data dump and an attempt to read patterns quantitatively into that. And so I think that we miss some of that richer picture about what individual users and what you know, segmented groups of users experience. So, you know, one of the things that we find often in research on Wikipedia is that we get a picture of a particular kind of user, and we don't understand the experience of women users, of non-white users, of people with physical impairments, older users. And so we just, you know, that's just not part of the picture. And that's an area that really needs to have more academic research into, I think.
Can I keep going, Martin, or do you want
Great,
to...
maybe one more question, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then also, a question was asked a while ago about how to incentivize authoritative users to be more supportive in these discussions. I wonder if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think, at least in the literature, there doesn't seem to be a clear answer. You know, people will often conclude their paper by saying, you know, it would be nice if everyone was more respectful, or let's be kinder, particularly to newbies. You know, don't bite newbies, everyone knows that. But at the same time, we find that there is a division of experience between people who understand the rules of the game and those who are still learning, or who just want to edit their paper on reservoirs in Utah, you know, whatever, rather than getting into kind of the deeper weave and weft of the Wikipedia norms. And I think that there have been suggestions that have been taken up by Wikimedia in terms of improving mentoring, finding ways to connect and make accountable more experienced users in their discussions with newer or more episodic editors. And I think partly that point in the recommendations about connecting up lines of communication is important, because at least anecdotally, people say that they don't know where the conversation is happening. So sometimes people will chop and change between where they are trying to find advice, or where the conversation is taking place. People might suddenly take it to their personal talk page. So understanding like how to notify and connect might be helpful, because I think that sometimes it appears that more infrequent editors or inexperienced editors make appeals to the more authoritative users, and these kind of get lost, or it's not kind of clear how to connect up that communication. So there's two pieces really to it. One is the tone issue, and one is kind of a more of an infrastructural technical issue. But yeah, I would be really interested to hear what the listeners also consider to be good incentives.
Thank you so much. I think in the interest of time, we'll switch to the second talk. Maybe there's a chance to reconnect some of the remaining questions to that too. Let's see that. But thanks, Anna, for now and for the question. And Sneha, please go ahead.
Can people hear me okay and see my slides?
Yes.
Excellent. Hello, everyone. I am Sneha Narayan, and I'm an assistant professor of computer science at Carleton College. I'm going to be talking about some research that I did with collaborators of mine at the University of Washington, as well as Northwestern University, where I did my PhD. And together, these collaborators and I are part of this intercampus collective of researchers called the Community Data Science Collective. And we, as a group, we are interested in research on online communities and online collaborative communities in general, and understanding sort of these big picture questions about what kinds of infrastructure make collaboration among large groups of people possible on the internet. And so in this study that I'll be talking about today, our big orienting question was, what role does interpersonal communication play in sustaining production in online collaborative communities? And perhaps sort of like a more specific way of thinking about this question is like, okay, so editors on Wikipedia might come together and talk together on talk pages or in other spaces about what they're working on. And what does sort of their ability to do that easily, how does that impact their ability to actually make contributions to articles, or their motivation to participate in editing articles? And so to sort of orient ourselves in understanding this question, we looked at the role that this form of interpersonal communication played in sort of all kinds of organizations. And there's a rich literature of organizational communication that studies both embodied organizations as well as online communities, and thinks about these questions. And some broad themes that emerge in that literature is that interpersonal communication is really important for effective coordination between people working on tasks together. So this is how people sort of decide what to work on, who works on what, develop workflows. All that links to interpersonal communication. It's also important for marshaling and motivating further participation. So if you're working on a particular task, or maybe editing an article on Wikipedia, you may use talk pages or other forms of communication with other editors to, recruit people to work with you, or to sort of ask for help and feedback. It's also it plays an important part in creating collective identity and shaping organizational culture. So, when people are in communities or organizations together, there's of course the actual work that's being done, but there's also a sort of sense of collective belonging that's developed when you sort of communicate with others who are in the organization with you. And that sort of sense of collective belonging or identity is often shaped by interpersonal interactions with others who are present in the organization. And finally, it's interpersonal communication is also, plays a crucial role in welcoming and socializing newcomers. So if you're a new member of a community or organization, chances are like you're going to want to be able to talk to existing members in order to learn about how to participate, in order to learn more about how things are done in the community. And like that sort of interaction between veteran and new members plays a crucial role in ensuring that the new members become effective contributors of whatever community you're in. Okay, so given this role that we've seen across the literature and how interpersonal communication plays sort of these central roles in ensuring that various aspects of organizational or community success are possible, you'd think that maybe online communities and wikis are like super good at supporting this. It turns out that MediaWiki's communication infrastructure looks a lot like the article page editing software. And this is probably well known in the Wikipedia community already, that like in order to talk to another user, you sort of have to go to their user talk page and you have to edit their talk page. It looks like editing an article page. You need to write in wiki markup, which is not sort of well known outside of MediaWiki spaces. And then there are also norms within the community about how you actually present the thing that you're communicating in terms of like how you indent replies, as well as how you sign using 4 tildes and so on. This has a lot of steps to it just to send another message to send a message to another user. And user studies of talk pages on or user talk pages on MediaWiki have shown that new users take up to 5 minutes figuring out how to even send a message to another user, and which is a fairly significant amount of time as like from just an interaction design perspective. This kind of leads me to the current study that I'm going to present, which is, I should clarify, not actually conducted on Wikipedia, but was conducted on a large population of wikis from Wikia. And so Wikia, unlike Wikipedia, is a commercial platform that hosts a large population of wikis. The wikis are typically public wikis, so anyone can show up and contribute. Like Wikipedia, though, it does use the same MediaWiki framework. And so a lot of the kinds of findings that we have about talk pages and such on this platform could be applicable to Wikipedia as well. Additionally, Wikia wikis are sort of different, are often different from Wikipedia in sort of their goals and nature. Typically, these wikis are about pop culture or fan culture of some sort. If you play video games and look for a video game walkthrough, chances are that is hosted on a Wikia wiki or of some sort. And so that's sort of the role that, that's the kind of content you'll find on this platform. And so people who worked at Wikipedia, which has since rebranded as Fandom in more recent years, they were also curious about this question of like, okay, we have this system that takes a lot of steps for users to be able to communicate with each other. What if we rolled out a new way for people to do this? So in October 2012, they created a system that replaced user talk pages on their wikis, and administrators of each wiki were allowed to sort of change global settings for their wiki to switch from the standard user talk page that you saw a demo of earlier to a new style of communication infrastructure called the message wall. And like user talk pages, you still need to navigate to someone's message wall to leave them a message. However, once you get there, you're faced with a text editor that looks a lot more like editors under the comment sections of various article pages elsewhere on the internet. It's essentially WYSIWYG, so you don't have to write any sort of wiki markup. And things like signing, indenting, all that stuff is automatically done. Replies are threaded, and they do generate notifications to appropriate users. So essentially, this represented a significant technological infrastructure improvement to the communication interface on Wikia wikis. And a number of wikis were invited to sort of transition from talk pages to message walls. And over the course of several years, once they sort of got a number of wikis to transition over, now if you go to Wikia and start a new wiki, the default option is going to include message walls as the way that people communicate with each other. So this rollout of this new feature caused us to sort of ask a more specific question, which is, how might this transition from user talk pages to message walls affect the communication and productivity of wiki editors? So essentially, if you make changes like this to really streamline and essentially lower the barrier to sending another editor a message, how does that affect general dynamics of participation along the lines of communication and also editing articles on these wiki communities? And so, we had a number of hypotheses about how this would play out. And so we felt that, okay, if we introduce message walls in a wiki, our first hypothesis is that it would increase the amount of communication that occurred. And this is sort of like a baseline test of the fact that, okay, you know, we think that what's happening here is that it's making communication easier. We want to actually test that that's the case by seeing if it makes a noticeable difference in the amount that people are communicating with each other. So to test that, we count the number of messages that were sent by editors of the wiki, as well as the number of editors who chose to send messages at all. Additionally, we weren't just interested in understanding whether this affected messaging behavior, because we talked about this earlier. The editors' ability to send messages to each other could have spillover effects in terms of how they actually produce content on article pages. So we were also curious to see whether there were spillover effects in terms of how the introduction of message walls affected contributions to the wiki content on sort of the namespace 0 or article pages of these wikis. So again, we measured that by counting the number of contributions that were made. These were the edits that were made to wiki pages, as well as the number of editors who made these edits. And then finally, we created an analogous set of hypotheses that focused more specifically on newcomers, because one of the hypotheses, one of the thoughts that we had was that the challenges in the user talk page design would possibly affect newcomers more than veteran editors who sort of got used to the existing system. But if there were a change in how these sort of changes, we sort of surmise that perhaps this transition would affect newcomers differently than how they might affect a general editor in these wiki communities. So we also measured communication as well as contributions from newcomers in these wikis. And so this was sort of the general model for how we conducted our study. And there's some essentially we conducted what's called a variation of a regression discontinuity design. And that sounds like a lot of words, but I'll do my best to break that down. Essentially, if you can think about this change from user talk page to message walls, on a wiki, that represents sort of a moment in time that you could imagine being, so this dotted line that I have in the center here, that would be the moment in time that a particular wiki transitioned from user talk pages to message walls. And we sort of, for each wiki in our data set, we collected data in the 8 weeks leading up to that transition and the 8 weeks following the transition. And so we got, for each of those weeks, aggregate measures of our communication and participation data, and these sort of both before and after the transition. And of course, once you have that data, you can plot regression lines and look at the general trend of what participation looked like on wikis sort of before and after this change was made. Then we sort of did that for all the wikis in our data set. Our study eventually sort of analyzed 275 wikis. And we plotted the regression lines for each of those. And then typically the outcome of interest we were looking for was this discontinuity here, where the regression lines sort of meet the size of the intercept that's created in this week 0 transition point. If there is a positive bump there, that means that message walls have had like a significant positive effect on our outcome of interest. If that bump looks negative, it's the reverse. That means that the transition to message wall produced a discontinuity that had a negative effect on our outcome of interest. So this was essentially the study design that we had. And so this is what we found when we ended up actually conducting this study and analyzing our results. Consistent with our hypothesis, we did find that both the number of messages as well as the number of people who sent messages increased in the post-message wall transition world. So message walls did actually sort of increase the amount of communication overall that exists on these wikis. We did not find a significant effect on the number of contributions that were made to these wikis, however. And then for newcomers, we found similarly a significant effect in the number of messages that were being sent to other editors, as well as the number of newcomers who were engaging in communication at all. However, we found we did not find a corresponding increase in the number of contribution. And in fact, we actually found in this case a barely significant decrease in the number of contributions from newcomers just in the aggregate. There was no significant difference in the number of newcomers who decided to make contributions. As an aside, we also did some extra robustness checks on these analyses. And I guess this part is a little more academic inside baseball-y, but I'll try to explain it in as general a way as I can. But one of the other things that we wanted to do, and one of the things that is sort of a big concern in academia these days, is that people sort of do analyses on these big data sets, but since there's so much data out there, it's easy to sort of run a lot of regressions and test hypotheses, and then actually end up finding a lot of spurious results through this repeated testing. And so we wanted to make sure that whatever results that we were presenting to the academic community could be sort of validated internally within the data set. So the way we did that was that we started with a whole population of wikis, and we split them into two groups. There was a training set, which was sort of on the left. That's a set of wikis that we actually worked with to sort of develop our hypotheses, do our analysis, sort of find our initial set of results. And once we sort of applied a set of inclusion criteria to our wikis that were things like, we only counted wikis that had some amount of, like, some number of articles on them, like to ensure that there were actually like more than like 3 users on them, because the number of these wikis were really tiny and you couldn't really see a ton of interaction on them anyways. So we had a number of inclusion criteria that's listed on our paper. And then this set of 275 wikis, that's what I presented the results for. And then the other sort of test set of wikis, it was only after we got our paper accepted that we ran our analysis on this sort of held back test set. And then this allowed us to compare, like, okay, we presented this set of results. If we ran the exact same models on this held back set, can we replicate these results or not? So this is what happened when we compared results of our training set with the results of our test set. Overall, we found that most of these findings were pretty consistent. So in general, for all our all-editor hypotheses, which is hypotheses 1 and 2, we basically replicated both sort of roughly the direction of the effect as well as the significance of the effect. So again, in both conditions, we found that all editors increased their communication, but not their contributions. We also found that in the newcomer scenario, we noted that we found positive, in both the training and test set, we found significant positive results for the number of messages that newcomers sent, as well as significant negative effects for the number of contributions they made after the transition. One place a couple places where we found minor differences were in terms of the number of communicators among the newcomer set. So that was actually pretty weakly significantly positive in the training set results I provided earlier. It wasn't significant in the test set. And then additionally, the number of contributors actually also became significantly negative in the test set. I think really what I'm trying to get at here, beyond sort of the immediate comparisons between these groups, is that what splitting our sample suggests is that, like, the most robust results from this study probably pertain to what happened to all users. And typically, the stuff that we couldn't replicate quite as exactly were about the new editors in our data set. And this is because there were a very small number of newcomers in our data set. And so there was much more noise in their behavior, and it was harder to sort of pin down exactly what the effect of message walls are. So, like, I think we do have some evidence of how message walls impacted newcomers, but it might not be quite as robust as our results on all editors. So what does all this mean? I think overall the story that this study suggested to us is that this transition to message walls certainly made editors more connected to each other, in sort of both all editors and to a certain extent new editors did increase the amount of communication they engaged in. However, we didn't actually find this translation to increased number of edits into articles or to content pages in these communities. And so what this, and in fact, like there might have even been a sort of, there might have actually been a negative effect on newcomers, suggesting that once these wikis transitioned to message walls, newcomers were making fewer contributions rather than more after the transition. And so why is this happening? I think, as the previous speaker said, I mean, this is where a lot of like qualitative research comes in, like actually understanding where and why people sort of interacted with this new system in different ways could like really shed light in giving explanations of this phenomenon. That study has not been done yet, but one sort of possible conjecture that we had is that there was a substitution effect that was in place. So essentially, because it's now much easier to communicate with people, that ended up sort of being the most obvious or tempting thing for users to do, particularly new users, where if, for instance, making a contribution to an article isn't evident, but sending a message to another user becomes like much more easy to do. It's easy to sort of supplant the any move to sort of contribute to articles with a move to communicate with another user instead. I will say that this substitution effect that we're observing may also be a function of how we set up the research design. So we really are just looking at a fixed period of time before and after the transition. It could be that newcomers are using the time post-transition to, ask questions and to like connect with other editors. And maybe this sort of impacts their contributions to the wiki further in the future. A different study design that looks at longevity of newcomers might sort of shed more light on that particular question. But since this was a very fixed time frame, that might be an explanation for why we're sort of seeing some of these patterns. But it still does suggest that in the immediate short-term period after the transition to message walls, we did not see an increase in the amount of productivity on wikis, even though we saw this increase in communication. And I'm happy to talk more about details of the study. I tried to keep them try to sort of keep things pretty general, but I did want to talk, sort of acknowledge my co-authors who helped me in this work. Their pictures are here, and this work was also made possible through a couple of NSF grants. And I look forward to hearing any questions that you all have at this point. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I'm hearing there are many questions.
Yeah, I can jump into it, and then folks should feel free to interrupt as well. The first one I'll pass on, Sneha, is a pretty direct question about your work, but I think for a lot of these questions too, and we had some remaining questions for Anna, it can be also more of a anyone can jump in if they have thoughts. But Sneha, for your work, so there was a question, any thoughts on an explanation or hypothesis for why contributions decreased while messaging increased by newcomers?
Yeah, I think I sort of mentioned this towards the end. I think there's like a bit of a substitution effect at play. Like if you sort of show up on a wiki and maybe you're looking for information and it's easier to see how, again, one of the features of these WYSIWYG style text editors sort of suggests that it's actually easier to sort of see that this is a place that you can type text in and you know, make a change in some visible way, and perhaps like sort of being able to do that is like a lower barrier of entry than making contributions to articles, and perhaps more newcomers are sort of directing their efforts in that direction as a result.
There's I think, in my mind at least, maybe a related question, which was what impact does kind of the topic of an article, or maybe with Wikia, even just the like theme of the Wikia, have on some of these effects?
That's a really great question. And I mean, again, this is some of the sort of granularity that you miss when you do these sort of big scale studies on 275 wikis. There's all sorts of topics that are represented, and we sort of have some sense of how this works in the aggregate. But I think absolutely, I have ideas for how to maybe like really dig deeper into this question and how this change impacted these communities. For instance, like we know that newcomers did communicate more in cases, but like, what are they saying? Like, are they asking more questions? Are they receiving more answers? Are there like, is there evidence of sort of more back and forth between users? And so I think those kinds of questions are like great for future research to even maybe see whether even if we don't see more contributions from newcomers now, perhaps there's still the kind of behavior that's associated with scaffolding future contribution that's being set in place. And I think also understanding whether some wiki communities versus others are sort of reacting differently to message walls could be interesting to look at as well.
If I can loop in a question that was originally asked for Anna, but I think is kind of interesting in this context. The question was whether differences were seen between wikis where the collaborations were largely like within a single language or within a cultural group versus wikis where the kind of collaboration was like something like Meta, maybe, where the collaborations are happening across, even if in the same language, across many different language communities. And I don't know for your Wikias whether you would have these sorts of effects going on too.
I mean, I think it's harder to sort of generalize about what kinds of collaborative patterns occur on Wikia wikis broadly, just because they represent so many different kinds of communities. And I mean, like literally you and a group of friends could sort of create your own Wikia wiki, and it might show up in our data set. And that could be pretty small group, like almost synchronous communication, depending on how you use the wiki and what you're using it for. But I think that's a good question. I mean, I don't have an answer from this data set, but that would be super interesting to explore.
Anna, did you have any thoughts about that? Not to put you on the spot.
I would just say I think it's a really productive area of comparative research, and I didn't find work that addressed that question specifically. And I think in the Wikipedia case study, it's really important to consider cross-cultural, cross-language interaction, and you know, definitely an area for further question asked about the Substitution Act, because I think that, you know, one of the things that I was talking about in my presentation is the idea that people don't, you know, what is this talk actually doing? What kind of function is it serving? Is it purely about trying to address article-related editing, or are people kind of seeking other kinds of input or responses? And you know, we know that there's a Wikipedia policy that is, you know, literally says Wikipedia is not social networking, and that there are kind of norms against trying to pursue that. And there is some studies that show that Wikipedia editors, particularly those with higher levels of activity, are less likely to use Facebook and to try and, and use other kinds of things, so that they're getting some kind of something that we might see in terms of wanting to build community. They're getting that from Wikipedia. And this question about whether easier messaging, better notifications would enhance interaction, or would it detract from what is the purpose of Wikipedia Talk, which is supposed to be directed towards enhancing article quality? And I think that that's a really big debate, and I'm sure that at Wikipedia there's discussions about how to deal with this kind of dilemma. We make it more easier to communicate, but then will that create a community inside Wikipedia that is not necessarily about editing, that is about other things?
I have another one that I think is I think would be good for both of you. And it's a question about some of the technical changes that are coming to talk pages. In particular, the question was, if talk pages switch from this kind of wiki style editing to more something that looks like comments, so like replying very directly to each other, what sorts of research that could potentially unlock when I guess the collaboration patterns are a little more clear?
That's a great question. I mean, I think this study, even though it's done on Wikia, sort of most directly speaks to potential interventions on Wikipedia of this nature. And so, like, I know that the Wikimedia Foundation sort of was talking about Flow as a system to replace various kinds of talk pages. I will clarify that message walls replaced only user talk pages and not article talk pages. And perhaps I think even in Wikia wikis, there's some amount of like, what's the space for what kinds of communication, what kinds of spaces are used for what kinds of communication, and that influenced interface design as well. I mean, I know that the whole question about where and how Flow should be introduced has been a source of some amount of controversy historically on Wikipedia. And I mean, there are sorts of, hopefully studies like this will sort of show that it might not sort of directly affect productivity in articles. That said, I don't think, and even though it says like, even though we find that it might not in the short term positively affect newcomer contributions, I don't think we should discount the fact that it does positively affect newcomer communication. So, like getting any sort of interaction or getting people's foot in the door if they're new, and like welcoming to the community in some way, like that sort of positive that positive effect of message walls, I think, shouldn't be discounted. Like there are many ways, there are many points of entry into these kinds of communities. And hopefully the Wikimedia Foundation and the Wikipedia community broadly will consider some of those potential impacts when evaluating these kinds of systems.
Okay. With this, I think we are at time. Or Leila, did you want to jump in?
I just want to say 1 point first, 2 points first, thanking the speakers and the audience for the questions and engagement. And the other thing is that if you're interested in the topic of talk pages, for those of you who are not aware, the Wikimedia Foundation has a talk page project particularly focused on improving talk pages, as Snehal mentioned. There has been difficulties in the past, like satisfying a lot of the real needs of existing editors in terms of what the talk pages should offer, both talk pages and article page discussion pages, as well as welcoming newcomers and providing a space where the editors can have more interactions with each other, whether interpersonal or for collaboration purposes. I do encourage you all to check the Talk Pages project on MediaWiki. If you're interested in that, put that on your watch list and just follow the work that is happening in product in that space if this is of interest to you. And I'll put the link in IRC and the chat here. Thank you.
Thanks for this pointer, Leda, for the project. And with this, I think we're really over time or at time. Thanks so much. A lot of discussion. That was really good. Thanks for the speakers, to Anna and Sneha. Really interesting presentation. To the technical and coordination support, Jana and Emerald. To everyone who joined the discussion here. That's always a lot of fun. And I hope to see you all at the next showcase in December. Have a good day or morning or evening, wherever you are. Bye.
Thanks for having us. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.